Good morning. This is David Benedictus from CoolCouve.
Hi, I'm Daria Ruggles. Welcome back to CoolCouve.
This morning, we're interviewing Ed Hamilton Rosales, the president of the local chapter of LULAC, which stands for League of United Latin American Citizens. And perhaps you didn't know that this is one of the oldest and perhaps the oldest civil rights organization in the United States. And we want today to talk about the national issues of systemic racism and how it affects us locally, and all of the issues that Lens helped us focus on, including police reform, social justice issue, environmental racism, on and on and on. So Ed, welcome. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
We're so happy to have you. Can you please start out telling us how you became a local leader? What issues engaged you?
The biggest issue that engaged me was a very round orange man who became president. For lack of a better focus, you know, I've always been engaged in our community, in our Latin community, from where I grew up in rural Texas. And for some reason, you know, that man and his rhetoric regarding Latinos in general and human beings in general just pushed every button that I had and pushed me beyond my ability to sit back and say, okay, I'm just going to look away. So when he got elected, I decided that it was time for me to make sure that my voice got heard. I didn't know what that would look like at the very beginning, in 2016 when he got elected. So in 2017, once he had his inaugural address, I knew that I needed to step up in a bigger way than I had ever done in my life, and that's what I did. I reached out to several different organizations to let them know that I was very intent on making sure that our voices were no longer quiet in our community. In Clark County, if you don't already know, the Latino community has tripled in size since 2010, but our voices have quietened even more than they were before, partially because of the fear involved in having any type of voice. So it was important that although I can't speak for every human being, I can speak for my knowledge and I can speak for my passion within our community. So I chose that opportunity to do that. So thanks for asking me that question. It's a tough question because it's like, well, when I was born, I decided I wanted to get angry, and I've just been there since then. So.
Well, I share your the button that I share your metaphor about the button that was pushed by the orange one. And I just couldn't believe the rhetoric and the racism that was just dripping from all of that campaign rhetoric that he was pouring out there. So what does LULAC do for people locally? What is your mission? What are your goals? You have projects you're working on, standing committees, things like that?
Yes to all the above. So the League of United Latin American Citizens is in fact the oldest Hispanic civil rights organization, and we stretch across the United States and into Puerto Rico. We provide educational relief, financial civil action, and support to our Latino community, regardless of where they happen to be. We started in 1929 in Texas because of the abject racism that was going on in the state. You know, back in 1929, it was against the law to have more than 4 Mexican Americans at the same time in a public arena. They would hang you or shoot you. This seemed to be wrong. Yeah. So 3 organizations of communities got together and formed the League of United Latin American Citizens. And we've been doing battle with the government since then. We focus in on education a lot. So our STEAM programs nationwide and specific to Pacific Northwest. Actually, we have the only LNESC, so Latin Network of Educational Support Networks.
Mhm.
We have the only one in the Pacific Northwest here in Vancouver at Fort Vancouver. That program provides the ability to find and identify children who are first generation American citizens who are, because of financial obligations to their family or through educational challenges, they're just not going to be able to get the same equitable opportunity for an education as others. So we go in and we provide tutors for them to get them their grade point average so they can graduate from high school and get them set up so that they can be prepared for college in whatever version that looks like. And then we also provide them with scholarships to those colleges. So that's our number one focus on youth, comes from and to that, making sure that they have the same educational opportunities as others. Civic health, we want to make sure that we have people in place that are seats of power that represent us, have our own experiences, and support us in that respect. Zero representation from a Latino or Latina at our county council or city council level, other than Adrian Cortez being our first elected mayor in Battleground. That's really been it for us. And it's time to change that. So we're working very hard on that. We also, this past year, have been given the unique opportunity to provide financial relief for our families because they, for various and sundry reasons, didn't qualify for the CARES Act funding. So either because of their employment status or their citizen status, or some combination of that, weren't able to access CARES funding. So they still needed to work, they still needed to get health care coverage, they still needed everything that everybody else needed, but they weren't afforded that financial support. So we provided that support with a partnership with several organizations in our area and then again in the state. We provided over $600,000 worth of funding to families here in Clark County that didn't have access to that before. And we continue to do that with rent relief, with legal access. As you may or may not know, we brought to light a federal action against Clark County for employment practices county level. That was our intervention with the 3 employees who have for over 2 years been discriminated against and verbally abused by Clark County. So we brought it to our legal arm, which is the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, who is a nonprofit arm of LULAC, who specifically focuses on legal action at a national level. So they filed a brief 2 weeks ago against the county, and that's in litigation at this point. So yeah, we're kind of in everybody's face right now.
So you had written, may I call you Ed?
You may absolutely call me Ed.
Okay, thank you, Ed. You wrote a very beautiful and powerful response to the death of a young Black man, addressing the reality of systemic racism here in Clark County, and in fact, the information that you just gave us about Texas, I don't think that's generally known. So how has systemic racism manifested here in Clark County, and what are we doing about it, and what can allies like David and I do to help?
That last part of the question is the easiest answer. You guys can continue doing what you're doing, which is highlighting the stories that sit inside all of this and allow that same story to be heard without dispute. For some reason, people can hear the truth and then they challenge it, and then that defeats the whole purpose of truth to begin with. So systemic racism, institutional racism is a founding core of our civilization here in the United States. I mean, we've been doing it since before it was a country. And most of the policies and protections that were placed were with an intention of making the haves have more than the have-not, regardless of the race that they're impacting, regardless of the financial status of those individuals. So up until we became a nation, we were doing it to the country of the United States was doing it to multiple people. It wasn't just the Mexicans and it wasn't just the blacks. It was anybody that wasn't sitting in the Boston colonies, as it were.
Chinese.
Yes. And even to themselves. I mean, if you think about the distinction between the colonies in New England and the colonies in Virginia, those were significantly different colonies, and one of them was prosperous and one of them was not. And the reason the one that wasn't was because that's where the people that came and established a community that were not the best of the best coming over from Europe. And you know, you always have to have someone just a little bit lower than you. So when the slaves from the indigenous communities and the slaves from Africa arrived, they had a foothold. We became the lower level of that class system. And so as every policy law were written, it was with that lens in mind. So systemically, it's been part of our culture and a part of our narrative since the founding of our country. You continue to try to build a better country, and in doing so, you have to expose the lies that sit behind it. And we find that, you find that in the most unique of places, but it's exactly where you think it's supposed to be at the end of the day. And when people talk about systemic racism in the U.S. today, it's been there forever. We've known about it. The people of color have seen it and known about it for our entire lives, and those of our ancestors and the elders that we stand upon today. The problem is people are discovering it elsewhere too, and so you're coming to a reckoning as an Anglo that we've been aware of for a while. We just have the opportunity to speak more clear-eyed about it nowadays.
Well, you know, as I was doing research for that, you mentioned Texas, 1929. And I came across this book by Brian Burrow and Chris Tomlinson, Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of the American Myth. And it talks about what really happened to the Alamo and what the context and culture was at that time. And it was a disagreement, a very strong disagreement between Mexico that owned that property at the time and the leaders and who was Stephen F. Austin, you know, the big hero of all that, promoted by the Anglos. And it was really a conversation about slavery and the cotton trade and Mexico was strongly abolitionist at that time and didn't want that trade in there. And that was the conflict. It was about money making and profit off the cotton and slave trade that all of the settlers were moving into Texas after the right around just before the Civil War. So people don't understand that, and that's one of the things I think that's so interesting about updating our history and looking at this idea of critical race theory. But people are saying, well, how do we respond to people about that? And people saying, well, you're being divisive, you're rewriting history, or you're making people hate the United States. And as a mental health professional, I think about, as you age, you integrate more with your life experience and reconcile with that. That makes you fully human, and you know your capacity to, without knowing it, harm other people, and you try to live more consciously. It seems like that same kind of principle would apply to a nation who wants to live into these very powerful principles of equality and diversity.
I think the interesting part that you bring up with that statement is that our world has evolved continuously, and it's always been with a fight to evolve.
Mhm.
You know, human nature is to believe the best in yesterday and the hope for the future
Yeah.
without necessarily realizing the reality of today. Thinking about the history that we all have in this nation, um, it's just telling the truth about it now that bothers people. Because we're not rewriting what happened in
No, no, no.
Texas. We're not rewriting what happened in California. We're not rewriting the disasters that the United States government had in their inability to honor treaties with the indigenous and the Mesoamericans and the Mexicans and the Spaniards and the French and anybody else that they decided to write a treaty with. I mean, the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo gave us our citizenship as Mexicans that were becoming American citizens overnight because of the agreement to give Texas, New Mexico, and Northern California to the United States. We were there. We went from being a Mexican citizen to an American citizen without any choice of our own. But the treaty guaranteed us our lands and our rights as citizens. But what it didn't do was make the Americans stick to that promise. What it didn't do was make the Americans realize that they couldn't make new laws without having them in Spanish. You have to remember that those areas of the Southwest United States was a primary Spanish-speaking area, Spanish reading, and all the laws that were being inflicted to that area were in English and were not normal to our society. So we overnight lost centuries of wealth in our land ownership. Haciendas were given away, traded away, broken away. They first were held by the Franciscans from Spain, who came in to teach us all how to be good Catholics. And then those lands that were held by the Spaniards were given to Mexicans that were dedicated to those properties. And then as the Mexicans developed their own haciendas and developed an economy from that, then the Americans came in and said, oh no, we want those too. So we're going to take them and you can stand on the side of the road and watch us. We have centuries of treaties that were held to the Native Americans of the North America that never have been held. So the United States just never held on to their own truth. It's easier to conflate it to what fits their narrative instead of ours. And all we're doing is saying, hey, let's talk about it all. We can talk about the wonders of the American government and the great things that this country has done, because there is plenty of great that the country has done, but we can't ignore the rest of the story and wonder why nobody wants to go backwards other than white men. They're the only ones that benefit from going backwards. Nobody else does, I assure you.
Yeah, including women. So
including women, especially including women.
Yeah. Let's talk about local police reform. How is LULAC involved, and what's the status there?
So interestingly enough, LULAC is fairly involved, specifically me. The city of Vancouver in their police accountability program and their committee on police reform includes me. So as we look to the PERF report that was presented in 2019 to try to make impacts on that, both ours and NAACP's voices are being used to help look at it from an equity lens. And from a Clark County standpoint, the sheriff's office and I work, and LULAC has worked for the past 3 years on trying to make sure that there's an equity lens applied to programs that move forward. Does that work? I don't know. We keep on trying. So I guess it's a good thing. One of the challenges that I have, and I made this very clear to both the city and the county when this work first started 2 years ago, was we'll be happy to sit at the table, but we will not be your tokens at that table. And I think that they of course said, no, we want you there because we want to hear what you have to say. And that was their honest answer. By all means, that was their honest answer. But I don't think that they were prepared for exactly what was being said to them. And those community listening sessions last year that we built out with several other organizations was a wake-up call to them that we all have true stories, lived stories, and truths that they can't ignore anymore. How do they deal with that? How does those norms of policing change in the middle of a very real crisis in our society? And I guess the best way to point to that is, as we've had conversations, seems like with the police accountability program in Vancouver, every time we went to have a meeting, there was some crisis that happened the day before. So that would be what we'd be speaking of. George Floyd notwithstanding, there was a whole bunch of people being killed nationwide and locally in the midst of trying to talk about police reform. And one of the nights prior to when Kevin Peterson was killed that weekend, there was a lot of police activity because of the deaths and the peaceful protests that occurred in Portland and in Vancouver. But the reception from the police was that Black Lives Matter was really a terrorist organization showing up, and the white guys that were carrying the guns were just there defending their Second Amendment rights. And this was told to me by our own police department. So, yeah. So it isn't up the street. It is literally here in our own community. And because I believe that they were telling their truth, it makes it worse. If they were just, there was nothing innocent about what they were telling me. And when challenged, it took quite a while for us to get them to realize what they were actually saying on record in front of me and in front of the representatives from NAACP and from the rest of the community that was listening in on that same conversation. It's really hard for them to realize that what they said is wrong, because in their mind, they were just telling their truth. But their truth is what kills our people. So whose truth should we pay attention to? The ones that are being killed?
Let me repeat back what I thought I heard you say, was that there were people that you were engaged in dialogue with about reprioritizing police response and about DEI and training for the police, and around the Kevin Peterson shooting, and there was an expressed opinion that BLM Black Lives Matter was a terroristic group.
Correct, and this was by a police officer.
By police officers, right? So that would help me understand how, in some of your op-eds, you talked about the institutional support for white supremacy, and I was kind of gobsmacked, or not kind of, I was gobsmacked by the Clark County Council's response to the statement about that, and that it didn't exist. And then in the listening sessions, that two of the counselors were muted and didn't have their cameras on, and didn't know whether they were listening.
They were out to dinner.
They were out to dinner.
They weren't really in front of us. That's my joke. I don't know. How can you want to say that you want to listen and then turn off your camera and not have a response when asked? Mm-hmm. How am I supposed to believe you're really there? Because that particular council person has made it well known that any challenge to them is a bold-faced lie and a bold-faced outrageous statement to be making against a sitting council person, when in fact that council is supposed to be our representative voice. Mm-hmm. They were elected for one specific purpose, and that was to represent all of the people of Clark County, not a narrow perspective of that. And so I continue with my statement that she wasn't there. And she proved it again last night when I was watching her actions on the county council call. She just has such attitude when people want to tell their truth. And I am I'm not overwhelmed, because it's at this point it's expected. I'm shocked that anybody can believe that that's a normal way of acting as a city council person. or county council person.
Mhm.
Well, let's talk about a little bit about the income inequality and affordable health care, and how LULAC is working perhaps with other aspects of the city with that. Are you familiar, Ed, with the Fourth Plane Forward and the Fourth Plane Commons that's going up, and how Fourth Plane Forward is actually a citizens advisory commission that is working to support local businesses along the Fourth Plane corridor, which is the most international and diverse of this city?
Oh, yes, I'm fully familiar with Fourth Plane Forward and their work in the community. And I'm proud to say that we have worked and will continue to work together in several opportunity zones within Fourth Plane. I am familiar with the Fourth Plane Commons project. Vancouver Housing Authority and I had some long conversations about what it would look like and how we could provide input as to what that would become down the road. And we shall see. They've got another year, and then hopefully we'll be able to see what it really looks like. So I'm excited about that. With regards to the first part of that question, health equity has a little bit to do with income inequality in Clark County. It has a lot to do with a failure to recognize the disparities that exist within our Latino community, both in Southwest Washington and across the state. As you're fully aware, CMAR Community Health Centers is the federally funded entity responsible for providing healthcare to the Latino community. They tout it, they have it on their board. It's everywhere, except the fact that we don't go there. The majority of our that would be a different topic for a different show.
Okay. We'll have you back for that. Okay.
We will have me back for that. But the Free Clinic of Southwest Washington, 75% of their patient load is our community. So it's important to note that the people that don't get funded for this work are the people who take care of us. The biggest tragedy in healthcare, beyond the obvious healthcare problem in the United States, is that not only is it not affordable to the masses, it's not accessible if you or someone in your family don't have full citizenship. So if I am an employee in Vancouver and I've been here for 20 years, I just let my visa expire and I stayed because I got to continue working, and my family in Mexico still needed my income until I could get them up here. I stayed, I continued to work, and I paid taxes even though I don't reap the benefits of those taxes, but I don't have access to health care. And without going too deep into that rabbit hole, I don't look for it. I have my own home remedies for almost any kind of cold or flu that I'm going to get. But that same remedy doesn't help me with COVID-19. And I'm required to work. My company that I work for doesn't provide health insurance as part of a benefit package. So I don't have health insurance through there. I don't have access to the affordable health care plans that are out there. The ACA programs require a social security number. I don't have that, so I'm not going to get that. Which means that I am forced to go into the free clinic or CMAR when they're available to me, or to the emergency rooms, because the emergency rooms will take me. And then they're going to hand me a $90,000 bill that I don't have money for, so I'm going to, not be able to pay that. And also, by the way, now I'm not going to go unless I'm really ready to die, because I know that another bill like that will show up. I had a family who, it was a mother and father and a 32-year-old son, that all three contracted COVID-19. And they were fortunate, if you want to call it that, in the fact that they went to Peace Health and Peace Health took care of them. And because of the way the federal government has some programs set up, even during the time of Trump, they were able to get relief for their medical bills. But the son was incredibly sick and had to be transferred to another hospital, where unfortunately he did pass away. That transfer from one hospital to another was $3,000. and the emergency, the EMTs sent a bill to the family, for $3,000, and they're like, I don't know what to do with this. That's something that most people don't think about. If you went to the hospital, would you think about the cost of care, or that if you needed to be transferred, you had to worry about whether you could afford the transfer, or if you had to have surgery, could you afford the surgery because you don't have health insurance? It becomes a major burden, and it becomes another stressor in your already stressed life, and it feeds the PTSD that you've been going through most of your life because you're fearful of what your neighbors will do to you or what your job will do to you because you're an undocumented person living in this country under the government that chooses to call you a terrorist. So that plays into a lot of our healthcare disparities. That's even before we even get to the problem of the cost of selling effect. I mean, everything that you can find as a problem as an Anglo in the United States with healthcare, you're going to double that when it becomes a Latino in need of health care. So it's a bigger issue than just one thing.
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and I want to put a pin in that and come back in a future interview and talk about the undocumented use of labor by big corporations and not paying for it, and using that cost savings to create low-cost products. And I mean, that's something that that's been going on forever. Those abuses.
But you got to love the fact that people will slide over to Tijuana to get good health care.
Yeah, I have a neighbor that would actually ended up living in Ajijic, and he would go down there to get health care when he went down there for the winter, and that's where he got all his health care, dentist, everything.
There you go.
That was cheaper. He was retired and he could afford it, but it was still cheaper down there, and good quality, absolutely. By the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what have you seen recently that you think is in terms of Washington legislation that has supported some of these diversity, equity, and inclusion aspects? Have you seen any progress lately that you feel good about?
Loaded question, but here's the answer. The answer is that in spite of our federal government's inability to take care of the people within their boundaries and borders, the state of Washington did step up in multiple different ways with funding that was provided through the CARES Act to the state, that they had the discretionary ability to feed down into our undocumented community. So throughout the latter part of this past year, the state of Washington was really focused on the fact that there was availability for them if they so chose. And by going through many community-based organizations, they were able to get access to multiple families across the state. So I applaud them on their efforts with that. So yes, absolutely, there has been some real positive goings and comings. And I think Governor Inslee has an open ear to what we're saying. And I think he has been gobsmacked a few times in our conversations, which is fine. It's good for you to be gobsmacked every once in a while.
Yeah.
And caught off guard by the fact that his own DOH isn't telling him the truth about the problems in Southwest Washington. Mm-hmm. We've had real benefit working with our state legislature, with Representative Stonier here and with Senator Cleveland here. They've been great big voices for us in the state. Them both recognizing the importance of our Hispanic community in the success of our area. Some of the laws that were passed this year, would we have liked them to be bigger, better, meaner, badder, and fuller? Absolutely. But we start with a step and we continue the walk into the future when it comes to police reform and accountability. We'll continue working with them on that because it's important to us. What people don't realize is that as they're killing a Black person, they're sending two brown people back to a state or to a country that they've never lived in, because they were in the background. The stories of the gentleman being deported constantly wasn't being reported because they were still alive. They were just not living here in Clark County anymore. There was an incident where gentleman was arrested for domestic violence because he and his wife were fighting, and the white neighbor was scared, so they got him arrested. And for some unknown reason, I showed up at the county jail and deported him before he even had a chance to get to his day in court. And that happens more often than not. It's just we were able to report the one while not being able to report the rest.
Wow. Is it that easy still to just deport people like that? Or was that a Trump thing?
It's still that easy. Things didn't change. You have to understand that the regulations that allow ICE to do what they do still exist. And we all know that we're in a county that isn't a sanctuary county. Although Sheriff Atkins has been adamant about the fact that it's not their policy to have that happen, it still has happened under his watch, and he's recognized that. So,
what's a sanctuary county?
So that would be where the police were not allowed to work directly with ICE in any aspect without a warrant. So like if I showed up with cause, then there's nothing anybody can do about that. But there are places in the United States where police officers find it appropriate to call ICE to say, hey, we got someone you might be interested in. That's what not being a sanctuary city or county would be.
Ed, can you talk a little bit more about this process, about the actual process that they're doing for police reform, and like what's happened so far and what you hope will happen in the future?
Sure. So the with regards to Vancouver, more specifically, because it's a bigger statement, there was a police evaluation by the state police association of the local police association about policies that may need to be cleaned up or changed or are ineffective based on our current laws on the books. And by the way, we just added some new ones, so we had to review the perps again. The intent was to go through them and put into place a more equitable approach to our community, while still keeping, the laws that keep us bound in place. There were 84 suggestions, and our intent is to complete all 84 of them. We're kind of mired down in wording at this point. We've been able to accomplish several policy migrations, so that versus instead of having like 3 different policies that say the same thing, we now have one policy that's a broader policy from a policing standpoint. So those are good. Those are good options. We actually have had some really good work in that regard, in narrowing down what would be considered police use of force. At the same time, we were allowed to expand the conversation to include body cameras, and of course, we now have a body camera program being established. Again, more good. The place that we have the place that we're working on isn't the equipment, because the equipment, it's easy. This is the best equipment out there. We have the money to buy it. Let's go buy it. So they're in the bidding process still to get the best price for the equipment that makes the most sense, which is very exciting. But policy on that equipment is a debate, and from our standpoint, from people of color's standpoint, so from the NAACP and from myself, our sticking point is we need to know what it looks like for a police officer who chooses not to obey the same policies that are put in place. And so, what's accountability for them? What are the repercussions for them? What are the penalties for them? And what is the city going to do to mitigate that? And it's really hard to argue with someone who says, well, it's a policy, who would break it? I don't know, the same people that are shooting everybody?
Are you like,
So
the policy being that you always have to have your camera off and you not turn it on? And why did you turn your camera off? I mean,
Yeah.
I see a lot of that kind of thing. And
right.
And
Right.
then also when it's available to the public and those kind of
Right.
issues.
Yeah. So like one of the policies as it's written currently states that the camera, well, one of the policies that are going to be taken up to the guild, because they're the ones that have more power than everybody, is that the camera will have to come on as soon as the officer exits the vehicle. Okay, that's cool. What if you shoot the person when you're still in the vehicle? Does that mean the camera never had to be on? And that's gray area. Well, we can't live in gray area. And so these are the sticking points that we're working through. But even at that point, when I asked, well, what's the ramifications of not doing that? The answer was there is no policy that talks about the injury to those that don't abide by the rule. I said, okay, so there's a separate policy that dictates repercussions. No. Okay, so you're still not getting anywhere with this. If I am a citizen in the city of Vancouver and I break a law, we all know something's going to happen to me. If a police officer breaks a policy, what are the things that are going to happen to him? And there is no clear answer on that currently. And then we're also asking that once all this is in place, we are expecting and demanding a citizen, non-police, non-ex-police, non-retired police committee to be the overseer of this whole program. We're still in negotiations on that. Because at the end of the day, we don't have that power. The guild has that power. And we're trying to make sure that everybody realizes that it shouldn't necessarily be the guild. It should be the citizens of our city that have the right of way on that.
When you say guild, you mean police guild?
So there are 3 police guilds in Vancouver that control the contracts for those police officers. And without a negotiation on those policies can't be written.
Have you worked at all with the new police chief? That was somebody that David and I, we understood from the mayor that he actually has a mental health background, right, David? Is his
Social psychology,
social,
PhD, yeah, right.
Are you referring to Jim McElvain?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one I'm sitting and talking to on a daily basis.
Oh, okay. Well, have you found his perspective to be a little bit more refreshing because he doesn't come up through with a police military background? He does have the social worker PhD. Is that right, David? Social worker?
Social psychology.
Social psychology?
Yeah.
So his degrees all came while he was a police officer. You should know that first. So he has decades in policing. His background is in policing. His perspective is as a police officer. He has a broader concept of it, of how that impacts social behavior. And he and I have had some very good conversations. We've also had some very bad conversations, but that's just to be expected. I'm not the nicest person, so that's cool. I don't find his perspective to be different than any other police officer I've spoken to.
It seems one of the key issues is the vetting process. I mean, you've got, how do you choose people that have enough internal coping skills, resiliency, that when they're in the moment, they can pull back. And it's well documented, for example, after there's a police chase or you get your you got your adrenal surges and stuff like that, you're flooded with all the fight or flight hormones, that there's a certain personality that can pull back from that. And also it involves training. You have to have training about other strategies you can use to pull back from acting on that fight or flight, in a fight or flight situation that ends up causing harm to another person where it didn't need to. And you see that time and time again after a pursuit, or in the more recent case where someone drives away on a misdemeanor charge and they end up getting shot. So what is that about in terms of police training and vetting and working with human beings and putting them in and making sure the people that are in those positions are there to protect and serve and are less likely to act out in a way that's harmful to the community?
I think that number one, human nature is human nature, and our monkey brain acts the way it does when we're at our greatest crisis.
Yeah.
And if you're, as I've heard already from police officers when asked those same questions, it's you train as hard as you can and as often as you can to be able to have differing opinions for reactions. But at the end of the day, if you're fearful, your fear factor is going to kick in, and that monkey brain is going to win. I mean, it literally is going to be what. So whatever you knew in the past is what's going to be what you're going to use for today. So there's no amount of training that's going to fix that. If your response at the very core of your mind is to kill someone in front of you, then that's what you're going to do. There's just no way around it. As well, social constructs being what they are, if you perceive a person of color as something less than you, you will always treat, regardless of whether you think you've risen above that or not, or been trained. You can't train someone not to feel that way. They have to come that way. And one of the conversations that the chief and I have had has been specifically to that recruiting process. How do you vet someone who knows how to get past all that, or who believes that they've gotten past that, as importantly? That's a hard thing. But what can remedy that is to prevent the police officer from responding to every crisis that's out there, and respond to those crises that require that type of response. So we can't expect the police officers to respond to everything and have different perspectives, views, and reactions based on the situation in front of them. They can't do that, nor should we expect that of them. But what we can do is expect them to only respond to those issues that require that level of reaction. So, in other words, if it's a mental health crisis, why the heck are you pulling a police officer to it?
Right.
If it's a domestic violence issue, why are you bringing a police officer into that? If it's a child molestation, is the police officer the best one to pull to that? I don't know those answers. I do know that they can't be the one and only answer to everything, and they've proven time and time again that isn't a working solution.
Yeah, we learned from one of our guests, Katmiel Garcia. She was telling us about a program that was in Denver that brought mental health professionals in where they normally would use police, and they had 0 arrests.
Imagine that. Yeah.
Imagine that we have a whole plethora, a cornucopia of social service responses to all of those unmet needs that we, through my opinion, from working in mental health and community mental health for years, is that we've shifted the fund. We've got at that funding and then expected the police, who are not the appropriate tool for that response, to pick up those responses, and then we get the extreme responses for not respecting the police officer's position. That's the thing that's kind of interesting. That's happening a lot. Is there's often a feeling that police officers have a right to respond to disrespectful language with force, which is confusing to me. Or the questions, right? Or questions, why are you arresting me? Why did you pull me over and stuff like that? I mean, it goes from 0 to 60 in a minute, especially for people of color, marginalized communities, that they seem to have that response more. But there's all these videos all over the internet now, right, about police officers not following policy and procedures, but reacting as if they're being disrespected, and then they have the right to take it to the next level.
In other words, authoritarian.
Right, because there's no punishment for doing that. So of course you're going to do what you believe you don't have to be punished for. So, my curiosity has been for decades, why, if you're a white man, generally white male, with a gun and a bat and chemicals on your waistband, why are you afraid of a little old brown person trying to run away from you? Because that is the justification for everything. I feared for my life and those around me. I feared for my life and those around me. You have a gun. You have probably several guns available to you. You have non-lethal weapons available to you. You have chemical warfare available to you, and you have the Justice Department behind you, and you're afraid of me. It just seems like a crock of bull, personally, to listen to the reasoning behind why they felt the need to shoot somebody. Oh, okay, so they're running away from you, but you fear you're going to kill them. It's 42 rounds. That makes sense. I mean, it really doesn't. That's what I'm blown away by that. And the reason is simple. There is no punishment for doing what you're doing. So you're going to continue doing it because you can.
So one thing you said, Ed, that's a little bit upsetting, the idea that if there's some sense of superiority or not recognizing someone's humanity because they're a person of color, that's that. So in terms of like training for DEI, I hope that you hope there's hope. But on the other end, do you think that bringing more people of color in to the police force and, you know, maybe having some understanding of exchanges of culture, that this could be a way to make some positive changes?
I think that that finding, and it's really difficult, but finding a way to have brown and black guys and girls recognize an opportunity in the policing world would be really great. We're just not there. Right now, it's impossible for me to believe that police recruitment officers think that if they just show up, they're going to get brown and black people to start working for them. It's never going to happen like that. There has to be a level of trust, and it doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen while you have leaders that aren't part of that conversation. So it's tough because I would love to have more brown folks and more black folks in positions of that. However, they're given the same toolkit that the current police officers are given, which is no great solution. So they don't want to be part of the problem. Therefore, they're not going to look for a way to be part of the solution. With regards to DEI, I'm going to say something that many people feel but don't say out loud. It is not a buzzword for Anglos to use, but it gets used that way. Every time I turn around, someone's saying, well, you know, we have a DEI officer now, so we're going to be able to fix this. No, you're not, because A, you're using acronyms instead of what they really are. B, if you're not using a person with lived experiences as your equity officer, how are you exactly going to fix that problem? And may I remind everybody that there are biases within all people, including people of color. So there is a vetting process for individuals who are going to try to use an equity lens in their policy persuasion and in direction. And if you're only using the words DEI as a checkbox, then you're failing everybody in the process. So it's encouraging to know that people want to do this. It's discouraging to think that as long as they have a checkbox, then they're okay. And I see that more often than not, unfortunately. So you're not the first person to hear me say this. So just know that that's an opinion that is held by many, but not very often shared. So.
Right. And the process to have true inclusion is you need to go where those stakeholders are. So I'm not. Yes, exactly. And that's even, there's this really interesting document called the Principles of Government Public Engagement, and it specifically talks about that. So when you have inclusive planning, you know, you're having, you know, this transparency and authentic intent and a breadth of participation. You're not just saying, here's a box to check, and we included this totem or this, and we're going to say to you which of these 3 plans do you approve of, and give you no understanding of how we got there or other choices that work. Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, we can't teach in school what you need to know, so it's a setup.
Yeah.
You mean in terms of the education system is proliferating the old lies?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And the idea that we would want to know the facts makes us seen as divisive and hating America.
And apparently we're the new fascists, which is interesting because fascism is exactly not that. But that's okay.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
I've been called worse in my life, so.
That reminds me so much of when you're a kid and the kid says something stupid like, I know I am, but what are you? Or how like when Hawley gave the to the insurgents on January 6th, he gives the Black Power sign. How our flag has been reappropriated to mean only one thing now. I mean, things like that are deeply disturbing to all of us that care about these issues, Ed.
Absolutely, and you're right. Our flag that we held in the most high regard has been turned into something that we throw in the garbage. When I was a kid, I was a Boy Scout. You didn't let the flag touch the ground. You lowered it each evening at the end of the business day or school day or whatever it happened to be, and you held it with huge respect as a child and as an adult. And for those people who fought those generational wars to give us the ability to hate each other, as it were. And yet now I can see it being drug on the ground in my neighborhood. I can see a picture of Trump looking like Rambo on a flag. I don't understand that. I'm at a loss on that. And it makes me not want to look at the flags anymore.
Yeah. I agree. There's a part of me that's afraid when I see that flag. I'm like, uh-oh. And it shouldn't be that way.
I agree.
So what are you seeing that makes you feel proud or positive right now? Maybe some of the because there's good stuff too, right? Some of the cultural exchanges or some of the opening up or just bringing more allies. What are you looking forward to in the future here, Ed?
The kids that I've been talking to. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you, we have some fired up Latinas and Latinos. Our kids, the youth that we've been working with for a decade in our school system, who are now college level kids or young adults, I should say, they continuously impress me because they have no bias and they have no fear. And they just say what they need to say and say, well, why don't I deserve this? Well, of course I deserve this. And they won't let go until they get what they're looking for. So I have great hope in that. I have great hope in the fact that our majority minority continues to grow and has found their voice, whatever that voice may be. I have great excitement in the fact that we're in a period in our history where conversations, as uncomfortable as they may be and as frustrating as they may be, are still being had by all. So even if you're an angry choiringer, at least you're having a conversation. So good for you. Let's go with that.
Even though she shouldn't be allowed to turn off her camera and mute herself.
Well, yeah.
So piggybacking on, we've just got a few more minutes left here. I know you need to go move on to another appointment. But when you think about this idea of developing a curriculum that accurately reflects what happened in the United States, like the Texas myth story, or the really horrific objectification and projection of fear onto immigrants, all of that stuff and that we can develop, and this idea of developing a curriculum throughout K through 12 and into colleges. You shouldn't have to wait to get college to get this information, right? And that there are attempts to bring multicultural groups together to have these conversations. Are there groups that LULAC is partnering with, the NAAC is partnering with to create this curriculum in Washington, state of Washington?
Yes and no. One of the surprising things that I've discovered in this past year is that everything we thought was already in place, we just needed to clean up. This really doesn't exist. So we're starting from zero, which means that we get to put it in the way we need it to. Some things as simple as, do we have dual language programs for GED programs? Well, there's not one. So okay, we'll just create one that's correct. And it just kind of goes across the board. Whatever we thought was already in place, but no one ever asked, isn't in place. So we'll put it in place correctly. From an education standpoint, yeah, we have a lot. We have Richfield school system, Vancouver's public schools, and Evergreen public schools. We're all in talks. We're all in talks about what that concept and intersection of truth and reality will look like. There's pushback, of course, because we have some crazy parents that just feel the need to say it's against their civil liberties to know the truth. But meanwhile, we're putting together what we believe is the truth from an educator standpoint and from an access standpoint. I'm very excited about the fact that there are multiple organizations that are educationally focused in Clark and Cowlitz County that are interested in having these conversations. They're interested in finding solutions, interested in creating new pathways for education for our students, regardless of their ethnic background. And because of that, I'm very, very hopeful that we'll find solutions. It may not be today and it may not be tomorrow, but we're in the right direction, and that matters to me.
Well, Ed, this has been wonderful. Thank you very, very much for having this difficult conversation, and we'll continue. We hope that these challenging conversations continue in our community, and we have more opportunity for people to have cross-cultural experiences, and there's more direct outreach to the places where people live and worship and work, and bring them into the conversation
with some good facts.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, there's some good stuff out there, right? I mean, I want to give a quick shout out to the fact that we have a Sikh community that nobody talks about.
Right.
That is they have some great programs that they're trying to put in place, and we're there to help them get through those as well. I mean, being a person of color means that we respect all the boundaries that everybody doesn't want to cross. And being me, I get to cross all those because I really don't care. I'm just going to jump into it all.
This has been wonderful, and so much to think about, and we really look forward to checking in with you in the next couple of months, and you can update us as to the progress and let us know what those young people are up to.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for taking the time to have the conversation. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, Ed.
So thank you, everyone, for listening to CoolCouve, and you can check us out on cable access and on YouTube.
Bye, everybody. Say goodbye,
Bye.
Ed. You'll be back, though.
Bye, I'll be back, yes. Thank you.